My name is Paul Malloy, and I'm an alcoholic. I want to buy a couple of minutes so that other people can get in the room, because I know people are coming into the room, but I do want to remind you that it was 20 years ago that we were in Kansas City for the second annual Oxford House Convention. And I looked up the other day as to how many people attended the Oxford House Convention in Kansas City in the year 2000, and it was 287. So when you look at your person sitting next to you now, you can tell yourself that that person is one of 1,632 people who are at this convention. I'm not sure how many Oxford houses there were in 2000, but I suspect that it was not many more than 300 or 400, maybe 500 houses. Today, there are 2,453 houses. $20,000 beds, and more than 450,000 people have lived in Oxford House. And at least 80% have stayed clean and sober. Before I get bragging too much, and just so the Lord doesn't strike me dead, let me encourage the last few stragglers to come in and grab a seat. There's plenty of seats over here. And we want to make sure that we get started in the right way. And the way we have always got started in Oxford House is to remind ourselves that none of us, nor the organization, is really, in fact, a higher power. We are just simple folks trying to figure out how to stay clean and sober a day at a time. And to keep our memories green on that score, we start these conventions and start our major meetings by having someone come to start us off with an invocation or a benediction. And today, I'm happy to say that from Kansas City First Baptist Church, Roderick Williams, the associate pastor, is here. Pastor Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Malloy. I was told to everybody I talked to said, don't take a long time, because they're familiar with pastors when they say, I won't be up here long. So get right to it. Let's pray. Most gracious Father, right now we pause for a second in our morning already and want to say thank you, Lord, first off, for waking us up this morning in our right minds. Want to say thank you, Father, for an opportunity to come and be amongst other people, Father God, that are looking and aiming to live a life that's pleasing to you. So right now, Lord, I just ask that the time here today be maximized, that there can be continuous healing, that you cover all the speakers, Father, that you cover all the people that are engaged in this momentous event. Lord, we love you. We thank you. We honor you. This prayer I pray in your precious Son, Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you, Pastor. I think that one of the things that each of us bring to these kinds of gatherings is a kind of respect for each other that gets more and more difficult to find in our country today. I think the reason that each of us brings a respect to each other is that we live in houses averaging 8 people per house, where we really get back to the basics of America, the whole business of democracy, where you have votes, you have procedures, you have that weekly House meeting, and for many of us, it's figuring out a better way to solve disputes and personality differences and problems than hitting each other with our fists. I mean, we learned a lot of negotiation in barroom brawls, and we learned a lot of how to not deal with things when we fought with spouses or girlfriends or boyfriends. But all of a sudden, we end in this new environment called Oxford House and are given a manual that says, here's how this place operates. And I'm sure that all of us scratch our heads and say, what the hell is a controller? I mean, I created that job 43 years ago, and I still don't know what the hell a controller is. I actually envisioned Whit Holden, who was the biggest guy at the time, as being the controller, and Whit says, what do I do? And I said, if somebody doesn't pay their equal share of expenses, on time, beat the shit out of them. Since 1975, it's evolved into having a different meaning. But within each house, there are these 5 offices: a president, a comptroller, a treasurer, secretary, chore coordinator. And I'm sure somebody moving into the house says, what the hell is this? And somebody else in the house will give them an Oxford House manual and say, read it over. Read it over. And when you read it over, you find out that all of these folks have a job. But the interesting thing about all of these folks is that everybody in the house has an equal vote. And everybody in the house votes on who's going to be in one of these offices. And when they vote on who's going to be in one of these offices, the rules of the game are that that person can only be in that office for 6 months. And I'm sure that in many houses, folks will say, why the hell, what's wrong with Charlie? We voted him in. And he's been there 6 or 7 months, let's keep him there. And other folks in the house will say, no. This Oxford House thing says you can only be there for 6 months. And somebody will say, even if Charlie's a good guy, why is he only going to be there for 6 months? And I'm sure that some smart ass in the back of the room will say, because Paul Malloy said in order to discourage bossism, you had to keep rotating officers. That's probably my ego getting the best of me. I have no doubt that people will say Kathleen Gibson said that, or James McClay. But whatever it is, all of us in this room who live in an Oxford House or who have lived in an Oxford House lucked into something pretty special. And we lucked into something pretty special because it works well. But we need to think about, why does it work well? And the reason it works well is we were lucky enough to be born in America that had stumbled into this miraculous scheme of folks living together without killing each other all the time. And the way we lived together and had respect for each other was developed a scheme of voting on stuff. And then, in addition to this scheme on voting on stuff, we had checks and balances and kind of guidelines that kept us within certain parameters. The guidelines for an Oxford House is that charter. Each house gets it. You don't have to be in a house long before somebody will say, look at that up on the wall there. That's our charter. And it says Oxford House, Green Street, agrees to 1, being democratically self-run, 2, being financially self-supporting, And 3, immediately expelling anybody who drinks or uses drugs. And within that broad framework, every Oxford house all around the country is pretty much the same. I say to Jane all the time that one of the great beauties of Oxford House is it's just like McDonald's. Any McDonald's you go into, you can tell the French fries are going to taste the same. They're going to be pretty good. Jane doesn't like McDonald's, and she doesn't like French fries, so the analogy breaks down. But if you're a normal person, not Jane, you'd understand what I'm saying right away. One of the things that we're lucky is that we landed in an Oxford house. My luck is particularly great because this person, Jane, that I referred to, as you all know, had me committed to a nut house in 1975. And as a result of committing me to the nut house and divorcing me, no less, I ended up on the streets of D.C., and from the streets ended up in the county-run halfway house, and thank God the county decided to close the halfway house, because when they did, that became the first Oxford house. Now, among the other characteristics of Jane is that she has the ability to hold a grudge for a long time. We were divorced for 13 years, and then we got remarried. And we've been remarried now for 30 years. A great and remarkable story showing my luck, I guess. But then our luck even continues. 6 years ago, Jane retired from the federal government, where she had been a smart ass who wrote all kinds of stuff, was on Hillary's task force for health care. I ran into Elizabeth Warren, of all folks, in the Hill the other day, and she says, "Say hello to Jane for me." I said, "Yes." Massachusetts doesn't have many Oxford houses. What's wrong with Massachusetts? But Jane is important to Oxford House because she has written most of the stuff we produced in the last few years, including this program. And I encourage you to read the program because of all the breakouts, there's a description as to what's going to be covered. And we are so fortunate that we get important people to come and talk to us and share with us the common concerns about alcoholism, drug addiction, and what has surfaced as a current epidemic among opioids. Let me ask the folks in this room, how many folks have used heroin or illicit drugs? Well, from reading in the papers, you all should be dead. But I guess somehow you ended up in Oxford House. And something about that Oxford House model changed the course of your life. You all probably watched that 60 Minutes video over and over and over again. I mean, it was 1991, and Jane and I, who are in it, have not aged a bit since 1991. But I know in house after house, a newcomer has to sit down and watch that video. You listen to Andrea and Alona talk about too much lint in the dryer, and that one or the other of them got a $50 fine. And at the time the film was done, or the video was done, I said to them, I would never live in a house with a goddamn fine of $50. And Andrea said to me, that's because you were a drunk. To a drug addict, $50 is nothing. Andrea had used heroin for 21 years at that time, and at that time she had been clean for 2 years. Today, Andrea lives in Fredericksburg, Virginia, in a house that she bought because she's retired. She went on to get a master's degree and make a lot of money as a federal employee and retired 4 years ago. Alona, the other girl, who had said she'd gotten a $50 fine because she didn't take her trash out, she got a PhD and has worked at the Howard University in the District of Columbia. Now, these are interesting things. They don't mean much in the scheme of science because those are just little stories about real people. But each of you who raised your hand is a little story about a real person. And each of us have been very lucky because we ended up in an environment where we were able to change our lives and change our behavior. And we ended up in a place that didn't push the idea that relapse is part of the disease, but rather you don't have to relapse. Is that right here? Now, I want to keep moving here, and I have rambled a little bit, and I was trying to kill a little bit of time to see if the person from the city of Kansas City was here to welcome us to Kansas City. Is the acting mayor here from Kansas City? All right, when he comes in, we'll let him sneak in and say hello. And we know they welcome us because they really lobbied us and said, when you guys come, please spend as much money as you can. And as a Washington Redskin fan, in case we have to play the Kansas City Chiefs, if you see their quarterback, trip him gently going down the escalator. Do we have a... Kathleen and James are going to speak to you as the morning goes on, but the first person I wanted to have speak to us is Kimberly Nelson. And Kimberly's taking Dr. O's place, who's noted in our program, because he was called away and unable to make this trip. But Kimberly has been with SAMHSA and is really the chief person in Kansas and Missouri. And so, Kimberly, would you like to give this crowd a few words?
Thank you. Good morning. Wow. So great to see this room full of recovering people. I just have to say, does my heart good. So it is my pleasure to be with you today and welcome you. I know Scott Wagner, the Mayor Pro Tem, and I know he would give you a very warm welcome to Kansas City. And there'll be no tripping of our lovely quarterback, Mahomes. We love him. I'm just saying. He's wonderful. I do have red on today, you know, it's Red Friday. So, but anyway, I want to kind of welcome you on behalf of the SAMHSA colleagues. Everybody knows SAMHSA, right? Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration. So we're that small part of the federal government that gets to provide leadership in the area of recovery. And I'm the regional administrator for SAMHSA in this region. And and many of you know, I'm sure, that SAMHSA has a long relationship with Oxford House. Yay. Your founder, Paul, has been on SAMHSA National Advisory Council, our Substance Abuse Treatment National Advisory Council. I think he just rotated off, probably only because he had to, maybe not because he wanted to, would be my guess. And I understand that obviously he has given lots of insight and valuable contributions to that, to the discussions that happen at SAMHSA around recovery housing. SAMHSA's leadership has a strong commitment to the effectiveness of medication-assisted treatment. I know we're going to be talking about that. I actually would like to call it medication-assisted recovery, but you know, that's not my call to make. But it's as part of a comprehensive kind of recovery process. We've recently formed a work group that is really around looking at recovery housing and this issue of medication-assisted recovery. And so more will be coming from SAMHSA out of that. And tomorrow I'm going to sit on a panel with a bunch of esteemed doctors, of which I am not an esteemed doctor, but I'll be sitting on a panel and we'll be talking about that. So I also, you know, think it's important to tell you that I'm a person in long-term recovery. And so, yay, I'm grateful. Yep. So, you know what that means for me is I haven't had any substances in my system since November 6th of 1991. And yay! So I remember when Oxford was first starting up in this Kansas City area. Many of my friends were in Oxford. I was in one of those halfway houses, actually. So I was in, you know, recovery housing really made a huge impact on my life and my ability to continue to maintain recovery. And so this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. And I'm a local champion. For anybody who's from this Kansas, Iowa, Nebraska, Missouri area, I'm a local champion for recovery housing. So if I can ever do anything that's helpful to you all in that process, I'm available, and people here know how to get a hold of me or just grab me afterwards. So I want to take this opportunity to thank Oxford House, Kathleen, and Paul, of course, for your contributions over the years to recovery housing. It's extremely important. A little hard to get into recovery if you don't have a place to live, right? A safe place to live. So it's extremely important. We've got Oxford representatives on our technical assistance panels or technical expert panels. And like I said, currently we've got a work group going, so you'll hear more about that. And I'm sure you're aware, SAMHSA just concluded, we do Recovery Month, right? So it was our 29th annual Recovery Month this year. Yay. And that theme was about joining the voices of recovery, investing in home, purpose, community. So Oxford plays an important part of that, not just in the home part, but also in helping provide kind of that community, that caring community and a purpose. So I applaud you for the work that you do, for the example that you set, for the lives that we get to save by coming together. You know, it takes a lot to kind of overcome this alcohol addict ego and come together as a group of people and live together in somewhat harmony, right? I mean, that is huge. And I applaud you for that work. And I believe that we save lives. That's right. It saves lives. And you ensure that people that are seeking that path to recovery get to be on that path. So, thank you, welcome. I look forward to spending time with you over the next couple days, and thanks for having me.
Thank you, Kimberly. Thank you, Kimberly. I think that, wow, I look over this crowd. This is unbelievable. I suspect you brought some people in just kind of to fill the seats who were at the tailgate party when the Kansas City Chiefs traded Alex Smith. Before we get to our next speaker, I want to give some time to Kathleen and to James McLean, because as you know, one of the things that happens at these world conventions is that you all elect members of the World Council. And the World Council is a 12-member advisory board that's made up of some alumni and some residents. And 1/3 of its members are elected each year at this convention, so it becomes a continuing kind of body. And I met earlier this morning the Kelseys, who were kind enough to have the World Council down to Arkansas, which is a state that also does not hire Oxford House outreach workers. However, they have the Kelseys who went from Kansas down to Arkansas, and they're good enough to have the World Council members down there to live, and James to look after their dog while he's there. But what that World Council does is truly the canary in the coal mine. Because folks on the World Council go out and see folks in other houses in other states. Every state kind of has a convention like this when they have a sufficient number of houses. I remember going to a convention in Virginia that had like 400 or 500 people at it, at a fancy hotel. I've never hid the fact that I'm a Republican, but the only thing I realize that you guys have adopted from me is that whenever we have meetings, let's use 4-star hotels. And you have followed that. And I accept the fact that there are only going to be one Republican idea you buy from me, but the hotel idea is the best. I'm sure that when James gets up to explain things about the World Council election and how it works, he'll also tell us who won the golf tournament yesterday. That golf tournament thing, long before there was a Trump, there was the Malloy Golf Tournament. And I've never played golf in my life. But James McLean was the Tiger Woods of his day. I can use that now because Tiger's come back. I began to worry when Tiger was down as to whether or not that was an insult to James. But Tiger's back. Kathleen, would you like to give us a few words, including the admonition that smoking, do it where you're supposed to, not where you're not supposed to. Let's not piss off the hotel.
Hi, good morning, family. I'm Kathleen, and I am a woman in long-term recovery. And what that means is I haven't chosen to use a drink or a drug since January 15th, 1993. So before I say a few words, I've been asked to ask you guys if you could scoot into the empty seats, because apparently we're running out of chairs. So if you just take a quick minute, and if you have some seats behind you, if you could scoot together, open up some seats, or raise your hand so that all the nice folks standing around the room can grab a seat if they'd like to. How long does it take? No. All right, thank you. And when Paul mentioned that smoking, they always let me get up here and do a lot of the fun stuff, like tell you what you can't do while you're here. Along with smoking, that means vaping. You are not allowed to vape in the hotel. Apparently that's been happening a wee bit. And if we do choose to smoke outside the old-fashioned way, could we make sure we dispose of our cigarette butts, please, not on the ground? Okay, all that out of the way. So I just always like to share a little bit about moving into Oxford House. I I shared a little bit at the women's conference yesterday, which, by the way, was amazing. There were 500 women in that room, and a few guys, but 500 women in that room, and all I could think of was the first ones we had like 30 people, so it was a great afternoon. But I moved into Oxford House, and I was going to stay for 3 months. And what happened is I'm still here, all these years later. I was one of those people that really needed to have that fellowship and that connection. I got that in Oxford House. I really became part of the family of the house that I lived in. The theme this year is fellowship, fun, recovery, and Oxford House really genuinely gave that to me. Has it given it to any of you all? So over the course of the next day or two, we're going to be talking a lot about all kinds of things, from research information to how to have good chapters in houses, and how to work on your own personal finances, all those kinds of things. So take some time and go to the panels and listen. It's only going to help you have a more stable house and hopefully be able to continue on your journey in recovery. It's been an amazing time to see how wonderful and how many people have registered and come to the convention. I kept saying, oh, people are registering. There won't be that many people. There's no way we're going to have 1,700 people show up. But I think we just might have that many. You all truly proved me wrong. I really like to thank the convention committee for all their hard work, and for you all for all your hard work getting here, getting other people here, your chapters and your state associations. So give yourselves a round of applause. Other than that, I just want to tell you to enjoy yourself. If you have any issues or problems, there's plenty of Oxford House staff around. I think we're up to about 134 on my list, which is unbelievable. We're going to continue to grow. Hopefully, we're going to have some opportunities for some new folks to come on and do outreach, and we're very much looking forward to that. We'll give you more information before we leave on Sunday. So with that, have a great couple of days. Enjoy yourself. Have that fellowship, that fun, and hopefully that will make your recovery even that much more special. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen. Jackson kind of told me as I sat there, you know, Pastor Williams' son plays for the Kansas City Chiefs. I didn't know that, but Pastor, I know your son will do well. And it just doesn't seem fair that God gives you a quarterback that throws with both hands. James McLean came into Oxford House in 1982. And James had been at the supervisor at the U.S. Post Office, and then as a sideline, has sold cocaine here and there. And then, like many folks, he became his own best customer. And he ended up in treatment, and he ended up in Oxford House. And they came into Oxford House, Northampton, which was in a fancy area of D.C. at Chevy Chase Circle. And the first thing that James did was to read the manual from cover to cover. I don't know whether it was because he was a union man. I don't know whether it was because he's the only black in a house of all whites. I don't know whether it was because it was way back in 1982. But boy, he's been reading it ever since, and he keeps telling everybody, read the manual. James McLean and Myrna Brown are emeritus members of this World Council. And what that emeritus stuff means is they got old. James is a year older than me. Myrna is about 2 months younger than me, I think. But we all were getting old. But that World Council goes on and on and on because you people elect folks to represent you on it year after year. And James, could you kind of describe to us what's up this year and the responsibility that everybody here has to vote for both the alumni and the resident members? James McLean.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. I'm a person in long-term recovery, which means that I have not had a drink or drug since May the 23rd, 1982. What's also ironic is that I moved into Oxford House August the 1st, 1982. Now, I can't tell you whether I would have used or not had I not moved into Oxford House. But I do know for a fact, 36 years later, I'm still clean and sober. The World Council goes to Arkansas, been going for a few years. And my esteemed senator always has given me this little thing to do. And I said, since he's here today with his wife, Doris, I want you all to do what he says us to do. I feel happy, I feel healthy, and I feel terrific. He says you do it 3 times, and each time you get louder. So let's go. I feel happy, I feel healthy, and I feel terrific. I feel happy, I feel healthy, and I feel terrific. I feel happy, I feel healthy, and I feel terrific. All right. The World Council is a very, very valuable organization, and we have grown so much, and we have done some things, some wonderful things, and now we have a lot of people who want to be on the World Council. And we have this specific system that we use to get on the World Council. Before you get on the World Council, you have to have a nomination petition. Now, I'm going to look to my right, and all of the current members of the World Council are there. You see this? Okay. It's a very, very high-class group, and to get on it, you must file a petition. Now, there are 2 kinds of World Council members, alumni and residents. But to get on it, you must go to the World Council table and get a nomination petition. Okay? Now, we don't trust you to walk around without petitions. So between now and noon, you have to get those petitions back to the World Council table. So you got to go around, you get 5 people to say on this petition. Now, if you are a alumni or resident, but you get 5 people and you turn this in at the World Council table. Now, if you some kind of way do not have a chance to get a petition, you can come to the World Council breakout, and they will also hand out petitions. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to take those petitions, and we're going to find out who wants to be on the World Council. And then we're going to make you come up here in the second session tomorrow and today and tell the group why you want to be a member of this prestigious group called the World Council. Now, let me give you a word of caution. We give you 3 minutes. Paul gives you a minute. So get your speech together and be ready and prepared to give your speech, and you want the group to know why you want to be a member of the World Council. When you give your speech, right, you will have a ballot to vote on, all your members, and you have to get that ballot between today and tomorrow morning and have that in by noon tomorrow. And that means that if you hear somebody you like as a World Council member, you vote for them. And those ballots are turned in. And then Saturday, tomorrow evening, we will make the announcement on who won the World Council, and we'll take pictures. So if you want to be a member of that prestigious group, get busy starting now so you can have all your paperwork in. Now, the World Council table will be able to answer all the questions. If you happen to not know, remember what I said this morning. In your packets, there's a pathways. And in the pathways, it will describe all of the things that I just said. And before I leave here, I want to say something. We have a few people in here who was in the World Council 20 years ago. One of them is sitting up front, is Julie. One of our first members, Joe Chavez, has been sick. He couldn't come here. And let me tell you something. He made 19 consecutive conventions. So our prayers are go out to Joe Chavez. If you have any questions, see the World Council table, the members over there, contact those guys. And I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful convention.
Thank you, James. I think that you all are familiar with how we really run the World Council election in a fair but disciplined way. And so make sure you get your petitions in. Make sure that you vote when you're supposed to vote. Make sure that if you're a candidate, you have about a 2-minute speech as to why you should. I notice politics seeping into Oxford House as I see postcards out there with pictures of people running for World Council. But anyway, I am so proud of the fact that you are all here, and I'm particularly proud that the recovery community here has always been upfront about the fact they were in recovery. In the old days, when I was trying to get clean and sober in the 60s and 70s, I talked to my Aunt Sue. I'm from Vermont, Arlington, Vermont, and Aunt Sue was my father's sister, and she had gone to high school with Bill Wilson at Burton Seminary in Manchester. And as I talked to Aunt Sue about who was this guy, Bill Wilson, and what was he like, she was very evasive. Then I said, Aunt Sue, there were only 93 kids in the high school. Why didn't you know him? She said, oh, he was a Protestant. So in Vermont, where we had very few blacks in those days, I'll tell you, the only thing we could divide on was religion, Catholics and Protestants. I was a Catholic, and I was sure that at least half the town would go to hell because they eat meat on Friday. And I'm sure that that half of the town knew I would probably become a drunk, and guess what? They were right. But from the beginning, the folks in Oxford House has said, let's be bold and brag about the fact that we're in recovery. Why should we be anonymous? I'm no longer a drunk. I know that because we have patience and tolerance and understanding within Oxford House, we protect the anonymity of anybody who wants their anonymity protected. But by definition, Oxford House has a house, it has an address, it tells everybody from drug courts to treatment providers to folks in AA meetings where we are, send folks over to fill the vacancy. So it really was hard for us to be anonymous. But since the beginning, we haven't been anonymous, and we've been proud of the fact that we're in recovery. More and more states now are organizing alumni groups. I think Kathleen told me there's 300 or 400 people in North Carolina that are part of the Alumni Association of North Carolina. colleges and universities are beginning to see the advantage of Oxford House. In Chapel Hill, North Carolina, there are 19 Oxford houses, and 2 or 3 of the houses are actually owned by the university. And believe it or not, there are some folks in college who are in recovery, and we should celebrate that. I think all of us in the country are concerned and wish we had a magic wand that would fix everybody who is addicted to alcohol, addicted to opioids, addicted to cocaine, addicted to methamphetamines. And the reason we wish we had a magic wand is not only because we care about those people, but also because those people, when they're using, are a pain in the ass. They cause crime. They keep knocking off 7-Elevens. They abuse their wives. They kill drivers on highways. We are terrible when we use. I never could tell whether I'd be a good guy or a bad guy. And finally, Jane helped make that decision for me by convincing a judge that I should go to the nut house. And in the nut house, they couldn't tell whether I'd be a good guy or a bad guy. And so they kicked me out, and I ended up on the streets. Well, those stories are terrible stories, but please tell them to the public, because there are people out there who are still suffering. I don't know whether it would have made any difference had I known you all when I was still a drunk, but it might have. Jane and I have a grandson who's 17 years old, and of our 8 grandchildren, he's the only one who seems to have drawn the short straw. But he drew it young, uses pills, using booze. We've helped support Caron Foundation now 3 times in a row, and I'm sure that they've built all the new buildings they need, and Peter will stay clean and sober. But who knows? The lawyer representing me tried to convince Jane to send me to Chit Chat after she'd committed me to the nut house. And Jane explained, I've had enough chit chat. And that story may have spread because a few years later, Caron changed his name from Chit Chat to Caron Foundation. Anyhow, some people take the whole business of addiction very seriously, and they're very smart, and they study the field. Jane and I were fortunate a few months ago being in Sweden at a World Federation Against Drugs convention. And the keynote speaker was Dr. Bertha Madras. And Dr. Madras has done a lot of things. She had been at ONDCP years ago. Then she became the chief architect of President Trump's Presidential Commission on Opioid Crisis. Everyone I talked to afterwards told me this is the smartest woman in the whole field. That's a heavy, heavy burden to carry. But she seems to do it well. She's agreed to come here, even though she's on her way to Ontario to speak to the Canadians. Probably something with that new trade deal that Trump has done. But who knows? It is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Bertha Madras.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for having me here. There are about 40 people I've counted that don't have seats, and there are plenty of empties. So show your courage, walk down the aisles, and grab seats so that you don't have to stand. I'm ancient, and I know if I had to stand for an hour or so with my bad back, it would be very painful. Most of you are young, so that's very encouraging. Why am I doing this? One of the most important questions I've been asked over and over again since I started doing research on CIA LSD that was in my institution when I was a graduate student. And there were 4 reasons why I felt committed to this issue. One of them was that of all the diseases of the brain, addiction is preventable. Many other diseases of the brain are not. The second reason is, of all the diseases of the brain, addiction is healable. People in recovery are living proof that you can get rid of this disease with vigilance, with courage. The third reason I'm in this area is because every single life is precious. Every single life is precious.
We're ready to go. Here's an advancer if you need one.
Okay, so are we all set? Wonderful. And the fourth reason I'm in here is because of you, and you. You give hope to everyone who's in the midst of an addiction. You have shown resolve, courage. You are the people who can go out and prove to others that you are a person with hope, with courage, and to destigmatize your life and make others realize that your life is valuable, it's precious, and there is so much hope in it. What I'm going to talk to you about today is the opioid crisis and the root causes. I can talk about LSD, I can talk about cocaine, but this is uppermost in our mind now. What the Commission recommends and what you can do to help. The ancient Greeks had a very interesting term. It was called pharmakon. And pharmakon meant a medicine and a poison. And can you think of anything more appropriate for drugs such as opioids than things that can cause relief of pain, euphoria, but also poison the mind in a way that makes it so difficult to find natural rewards of the brain. And the number one reason that people resort to opioids is because of pain. And the pain and pleasure centers in the brain are very closely linked. Now, we have become a nation of opioid pills. Let me just go backwards. We are the number one country that prescribes opioids in the world. We prescribe on average 5 times more than any other nation on earth. We also are the number one country in the world in terms of opioid overdose deaths. And in 2017, it's estimated that 72,000 people have died because of overdose deaths. Not only opioids, but also cocaine and methamphetamine. But there is good news. The good news is that a number of states have seen a drop in overdose deaths. These include Massachusetts, and Vermont, Wyoming, Oklahoma, right next door, New Mexico, the Dakotas, Utah, and Kansas itself. Yes, yes. We also see that the number of deaths due to fentanyl is increasing very rapidly. Fentanyl is a poison that's coming to us from foreign countries. In the past 8 years, it has been the leading cause of overdose deaths. Currently, heroin is number 2, prescription opioids are next, cocaine is next, and methamphetamine. And there is good news from SAMHSA. There are fewer people misusing opioids. The number of people who started using heroin in the past year has dropped by 50%. Yes, yes. And the number of people who have an prescription opioid use disorder has also declined. So there is good news, and more people are in treatment than ever before. 700,000 last year, 1.1 million in the 2017 NISTA data. So what happened? How did our country get into this dreadful situation? We can definitely say it began with prescription opioids. That is not even disputed. But how did we get to where we are now? How many of you know that 200 years ago, we had a terrible opioid addiction crisis in the country? 200 years ago. Most of the people who had the problem were women until the Civil War. And during the Civil War, men were increasing in opioid addiction as well because they were administered morphine through a syringe. And this is from 1823, 1825. You don't have to read it. But it was 2 physicians who published in the most prestigious journal of America, which is the New England Journal of Medicine, the only one at the time, that tried to overcome an overdose. One of them developed a stomach tube to suck out the contents. And another one gave people vinegar, acetic acid, to try to make them vomit. So 200 years ago, we knew that opioids were addictive. We knew that opioids could kill. What happened? We knew they were addictive. We knew you could overdose. And we didn't have any good science that said they're effective for use in chronic pain. And we had generational forgetting. People forgot our history, people didn't learn it, and then in 1980, the same prestigious journal published a little 5-sentence letter to the editor that said, "Addiction is rare in patients treated with narcotics." It's rare. They forgot. And I showed this to medical school students, Harvard Medical School students a few months ago, and I said, find out what's wrong with this letter. Tell me what is the fallacy here. And in 5 minutes, they were able to find it. But what happened with this letter? What happened was the evidence was so weak for claims of non-addiction. But within decades, that letter got so many citations in the biomedical journals. Over 600 journal articles said, this is true, this is right, this is accurate. 600. And it empowered people in many sectors of our society to begin to prescribe opioids and to push opioids. So what happened? We began to shift and put pressure on the medical community to manage pain. So physicians were sued if pain was not managed. There was a patient movement. This is a tragedy for needless pain. The pharmaceutical industry said, aha, this is a time to jump in. And they spent tens of millions of dollars promoting opioids. One company sponsored 20,000 events, 20,000 different events. Like this conference, they sponsored 20,000 to promote opioids. They sent detailers to doctors' offices pushing the drugs. And the Veterans Administration adopted pain as the fifth vital sign. And then the Joint Commission that accredits healthcare organizations also adopted pain as a fifth vital sign. And the story was on. The pressure was to address pain with opioids. It began and it continued until very recently. And then the Open Society Institute, which has brought us the marijuana movement in our country, put out a pamphlet that said patients in pain are casualties of the war on drugs. They never let up. And then in every doctor's office, we had a pain scale of 1 to 10, 0 to 10. Do you have pain? Even if people didn't come there with pain. People could walk into a doctor's office with a cough or with diarrhea, and they would say, oh, do you have pain? And the patient would say, well, maybe I have back pain. And they'd say, well, we've got to do something about that, even if it wasn't uppermost on their mind. And so we developed a system where we issued 300 to 400% more opioids than in the past. And we developed a number of patients who were misusing opioids. We developed a number of patients who developed an addiction, and we developed a number of people who got diverted opioids. Diverted, what does that mean? It means someone with a toothache who has a tooth pulled gets 90 Percocets. They use 1 or 2 on the first day, that's all they need. And there's 88 left in their medicine cabinet. And those can be taken from the cabinet, they can be sold. That's how bad the system has been. And then came heroin. The cartels in Mexico were watching. They have constant vigilance on our country. They grid out where they're going to sell these things. And they began to increase the purity of heroin. They began to lower the price of heroin. And they began to distribute heroin with almost a vengeance on our country. And then what happened? Heroin has changed the landscape, and so did fentanyl. In 2005, 90% of people in treatment for heroin use disorder started their first exposure to opioids via prescription drugs. By 2015, that number dropped to about 67%. Even that means that people were not adequately screened, they were not adequately treated conscientiously if they progressed to heroin from prescription opioids. There are many people that I've spoken to in my lifetime about drug policy, and there are many people who say supply reduction is a waste of time. We don't need border agents, we don't need the DEA, we don't need any of this criminal justice involvement. What we need is prevention and treatment and recovery alone. But I'd like to show you one example of why that's wrong. When I served as the deputy director for demand reduction, we had a horrible fentanyl overdose crisis 12 years ago in this country. In the course of 1 year, 1,000 people died, and we were in a panic. I was in a panic. I called John Walters, the director of ONDCP, when he was in Texas. I said, we have to do something about this. This is terrible. Every day in the news clips, another person's dying. This cannot be. And we organized a conference in Philadelphia to get together first responders, treatment providers, law enforcement, emergency department physicians, to try to alert them to this crisis, this emergency, because it was, for me, it was on me. Every death was my death. I could not tolerate it. And then I was told there is a lab in Mexico, in Toluca, Mexico, that's the primary source for the fentanyl. And that lab was taken out, and the whole crisis disappeared. And the death rates went back to baseline, very, very low. So we have to recognize that law enforcement, that supply reduction does play a role, because it's saved countless lives during the 2000s. And now along comes fentanyl. Fentanyl, this is an American copper, a copper penny, and beside it are little grains that look like salt or sugar grains. That's the amount that kills. That is the amount of fentanyl it takes to kill. And this is a comparison of the dose that can kill between heroin, carfentanil, and fentanyl. Fentanyl and carfentanil are little tiny fingerprints of flour or sugar that can kill compared to a dose of heroin. And so this was a seizure that was just happened. This is 1 kilogram, that's 2.2 pounds of fentanyl, and it can kill 500,000 people, that amount, 500,000 people. So with fentanyl coming in, we now have a perfect storm. So what lessons did we learn from this? We learned that vast amounts of money were spent to promote prescription opioids, to have, at one point when I was in Washington, we had 900 billion pills. 9 billion pills for every man, woman, and child in this country. 9 billion pills prescribed in 1 year. They were promoted for many medical conditions for which there was no evidence. They were promoted as safe and not addictive. There was no scientific evidence for their use in chronic pain. Advocates, the loudest voices were heard, but the opponents that generally have soft voices were not listened to. And addiction and diversion were not anticipated. High-potency drugs then flooded the nation. Medical education was far behind this. Only 30% of medical schools even taught addiction. And yet all these scientists and physicians in addiction medicine claim it's a disease, and yet it's not taught. And above all, government regulations didn't protect the population. They regulate scheduled drugs like oxycodone and hydrocodone very carefully. They regulate the chain of custody, how much you can produce. They regulate prescriptions. They regulate physicians who are allowed to prescribe. All these regulations were meaningless in the face of pressure money, advertising, and so on. And then the President's Commission was formed. There were 6 of us, 3 governors, former Congressman Patrick Kennedy, the Attorney General Pam Bondi from Florida, and this little ancient lady who was the shortest of the lot by far. And in order to try to increase my stature, I bought 4-inch heels to try to elevate myself. I bought shoes with studs to try to weaponize myself. But nothing worked. The only thing that worked was a soft voice and hard work. And by July of last year, July 7th, 2017, I had on my computer 250 chapter titles for the commission. And Governor Christie, who I emailed him to because he chaired the commission, he called me up and he said, "Hey, kid, now when you call a 100-year-old lady kid, you're friends for life. You're best friends." If I'd been called kid at 18, I would have been insulted, but at 100 years, it's a compliment. And he said, "Let's simplify it. Nobody's going to read it. Let's make it," because he said 250 titles is about 500 pages. I said yes, and so we simplified it, and he asked me to shepherd the report. What were we charged with? What is the federal funding available? What is prevention? How effective is prevention? What about treatment, overdose reversal, availability, and recovery? How effective are our educational messages? And what is the federal government budget for prevention, treatment, recovery, and how can we improve it? And how can we give recommendations to the president on the federal response? So the beginning I started with, how do we begin? We begin with supply. Where is the drug? Where are drugs coming from? Fake pills, prescriptions, heroin, fentanyl. How do we prevent the supply? What are the risk factors for people who become users and then become addicted? How do they initiate? How do they escalate? How do they develop an opioid use disorder? In withdrawal, how can we help them during that period to prevent relapse and treat and abstinence and recovery and lifelong abstinence? And what about the impact on children, on families, on health, on safety? And what about overdoses and rescue? All of these things. We made 56 recommendations. Prevention, in treatment, in rescue, in recovery, in research, and who would do these things, and accountability above all. Because we wanted to make sure that when a state gets a grant, a block grant, they're going to do what they say they would do with this money. And these were some of the chapters. I'm not going to get into details about it. But one of the reasons I went into the history of how we got here was to reverse engineer the mistakes we made in the past. Doctors' feet were held to the fire. They were pressured to administer opioids, pressured because they didn't have good education on prescribing and what the harms could be, because patients didn't have good education, because there was such a focus on pain as a fifth vital sign, because our own federal agency, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, discouraged pain relief with non-opioids. There was no guidance on how to prescribe. There were financial incentives to prescribe, insurance barriers, there was medical record problems. And then when prescriptions tightened, people who were desperate and nobody seemed to care, they reverted or converted to heroin use. So our first goal was to look at all these causes and get rid of them in recommendations, which we did. And then we talked about prevention. Everyone who knows the 1980s remembers This Is Your Brain on fried eggs. But there's not good evidence that it worked, but we realized that social media, getting to people who are asking questions about drug use online or asking questions about treatment or recovery, can be addressed by modern methods of communication. We looked at prevention in terms of young people. Start early, start early. Try to screen people in high schools and look as to whether or not they have problems so we can intercept, we can intervene before they progress into bigger and bigger problems. We looked at supply reduction in terms of increasing the sentencing for fentanyl. Why? Because fentanyl is a poison. If people were selling rat poison on the streets or strychnine or ricin on the streets, shouldn't they be in serious legal trouble? Fentanyl is in that category. It can kill instantly. We wanted to regulate pill presses. One young man, a freshman at a university, was stressed out because he was starting college. And a friend said, here's a Xanax, here's a sleep help, a relaxant that'll help you tonight. His friend and he didn't realize it was a fake pill stamped to look like a benzodiazepine, a relaxant, but it was pure fentanyl. And he died. He died within an hour of taking that pill because fake pills are coming in and fake pill presses are coming in. Targeting counterfeit pill producers, technology for border protection, and trying to get countries to stop sending precursors to countries such as Mexico and to prevent diversion of prescription opioids. We recommended that the healthcare community get an education finally on this problem. It's not adequate that only 30% of medical schools teach anything about addiction and recovery. And it makes stigma much worse when they don't learn it. Much worse. Before you start administering opioids, screen people for risk. Screen people if they have a serious pain problem. People who have mental health problems, people who have had terrible stressors in childhood are at much greater risk. Screen people for suicide. Learn about opioids, detect opioid use disorder in patients, educate patients, treat with quality treatment, recognize stigma. Yes, prescriptions are dropping in the country, but somebody scrutinized medical records and found that 30% of opioid prescriptions are given for medical conditions that have no pain associated with it. Can you imagine giving these powerful painkillers to people who don't even have pain? Help people in transitions from opioids to safer alternatives, from opioid use disorder to treatment, from overdose rescue to treatment, from treatment to long-term recovery, and from one level of care to another. The last two are core of what Oxford House does, and I commend you so much. The reason that Oxford House is so critical is that if you do the first three and not the last two, you're not going to solve the problem. You need to develop in an individual life a sense of hope and purpose that the recovery state is far more rewarding than the drug-induced state. Yes, yes, yes. And then reduce the prescription supply with different forms of therapy, exercise therapy, alternatives, and improve prescribing practices. We also developed solutions in terms of screening and rescue, medications-assisted treatment, recovery support, and research. Now here is the tragedy of not reporting overdoses. 7% of people are likely to die within 1 year, and they're likely to die from a number of causes, but the death rate is so much higher amongst people who are not attended to. It's unacceptable. It is unethical. It is just morally wrong. And then we said expand treatment in many places, expanded with telemedicine where there are rural communities. I put into the report we should have treatment on demand within 24 to 48 hours. People should be able to do this. And recovery support services. Of course, and all improve treatment, improve and support quality recovery homes. Oxford House. Support recovery coach training. And quality in treatment includes a number of issues. Improve the government response, for heaven's sakes, because the government alone will never solve this, but the government has a significant role to play. And of course, big research. And then I'd like to talk a little bit more on recovery, because Oxford House, I call it an acronym for HOPE. It is where hope begins, hope is reinforced, and hope continues after you leave. The recovery section of the Commission report said we have to develop policies for practice and advocacy. We have to follow and implement guidelines and reimburse for recovery support with all these sections in the Commission report. But this Wednesday, today is Friday, 2 days ago, in an unprecedented, bipartisan way, the opioid bill was passed. And many, but not all of our recommendations were in the bill. They expanded some of them. But I'm not even going to go through these. These are sections that involve opioid recovery and recovery in general, building communities of recovery, technical assistance, and so on. Recovery housing, the Career Act, stable. In all of these, there was an awareness, a recognition that without the recovery mode, treatment, rescue, prevention is never going to be enough. So what can we do? We have to prevent, we have to educate, and we have to support recovery and reduce stigma. The White House launched a new anti-opioid ad campaign aimed at youth, and this is the website for it. We have to prevent environmental risks for a child's drug use, because these increase a child's use of drugs. If they're abused at home, if they witness fights at home, if they are neglected at home, if parents give mixed messages about drugs, if parents use drugs, if children have unlimited access to social networks, and marijuana is helping to drive this. What is so tragic is that if children have been maltreated at home, about half will develop a substance use disorder. They're more likely to use illicit substances, to use in early adolescence. They're more likely to have severe problems. They're more likely to relapse. And if they use marijuana, they're much, much more likely to use other drugs. And that's true for opioids, and they're also more likely to have depression. And that's true for the 12 to 17-year-old and the 18 to 25-year-olds. Educate parents. Educate on the potential lethality of fentanyl. As I said, this amount, which is a Domino sugar box of 2 pounds, can kill 500,000 people. Educate patients, prevent diversion of opioids. Learn how terribly hazardous, how life-threatening they are, and even more so in combination with alcohol and other drugs. Learn how to get rid of the extras and learn never to share medicines. This young kid on college campus, he thought he was doing his friend a favor by sharing a little pill, and that pill killed his friend. Learn, educate. What are opioids? Morphine, codeine, heroin, fentanyl, oxycodone, hydrocodone, hydromorphone, meperidine, methadone, oxymorphone, tramadol, even cough syrup. Any one of these in the right amount can kill. And educate on overdose reversal. This is a photograph of the brainstem, and the orange area is where the opioid sites are that regulate heart rate and breathing, and they're full of opioid receptors. And when that target is inundated, it's full flush with opioids. At first, there's shallow and slow breathing, pinpoint pupils, slow heart rate, low body temperature, and then stupor and coma with death, followed by fixed dilated pupils. Train people on how to administer naloxone so they don't overdose. Parents have an enormous influence on their children's drug use. If they don't use, if they take a strong stand, about 5% of their children use. If they don't take a strong stand or they use themselves, it's about 35%, 7 times higher. Educate children, educate them. Reduce stigma, because stigma can lead to denial of services. Stigma leads to physicians not screening. Stigma leads to low reimbursement in the healthcare system. Educate, educate. You are the best people in the world to educate the public and the healthcare system. You are the best because you are the living embodiment of the fact that your life is valued and recovery is possible. You represent the front lines of this education. And then we proposed research, which I don't get onto, and then it was over. And we issued the report, and I'd like to close with 2 thoughts. There are many entertainers, singers, actors who have perished from opioids. We all know Chris Farley and John Belushi and Elvis Presley and Anna Nicole Simpson and River Phoenix and Michael Jackson and Prince and so on. But alas for those that never sing and die with all the music in them. Weep for the voiceless who have known the cross without the crown of glory. Weep for those hundreds of thousands of people who, for reasons that I cannot conjure, did not have the hope, did not have the good fortune the resources, the resolve to be in recovery. Weep for them. And finally, I'd like to close with one thought. The brain is the brunt of drug use. It is what makes us lose the type of behaviors that enable us to survive, to administer justice, to love others, to enjoy theater and music and create it. The brain is the repository of our humanity. And this, to me, is not a war on drugs. It's a defense of our brains, the heart and soul of what makes us human beings. Thank you.
Dr. Manders, thank you. That is probably a landmark, best kind of presentation we've had in 20 years. We are all ears to share expertise that we can carry forward to the rest of the country to share with folks what we have done. And when you go to Canada, tell those Canadians that even though they're different from America and don't have that spirit of self-help, they still should create more Oxford houses. I want to let Jackson come up here for a minute and tell us about the other rooms, because we're going to take a little break and then get into the other sessions of this convention, which are breakout sessions. Each breakout session has 5 separate sessions. I recommend that if you're all from the same house, kind of go to different sessions so you can bring home the message. But we cover a lot of heavy subjects here, and we cover it in a short period of time. Jackson, where are these sessions going to be?
Good morning. In your program and in your app, if it says number 1, it's in here, so you can just stay put. Number 2, 3, 4, and 5 are all going to be on the level above registration. So, above the lobby, you take the escalator up to the terrace, turn right around and take the escalator up, and there are going to be breakout sessions. If you were in the women's conference, it's those rooms. We just put up air walls to separate them into breakout rooms, and they're in order when you go up. So 2, 3, 4, 5 are going to be in order as you go down the hallway. So pay attention to your program or to the app that has all of the sessions listed on it. They are numbered. Number 1's in here. 2, 3, 4, 5 are on the ballroom level above registration.
All right, with that, grab a little quick break and then make sure you hit those next sessions. Thanks.